Okay, it's time for us to begin tonight. It's a little bit after time, so we're going to study Revelation 17 here in just a little bit. But before we do that, let's pray. Heavenly Father, we're thankful for this day. We're thankful for the health you've given us that we could be here. We realize there are many that can't be here because of their health. And please help us to help them, and please be with them that they may recover to a full measure of health. Father, we're thankful for this text that you've given us to study tonight. Please help us to do our best to understand it and apply the principles to our lives to be more like Jesus. In his name we pray. Amen. All right, so with Revelation 17, we've actually now moved past this troublesome middle section. And I say troublesome as when I began the class, I said this was probably the most difficult part of the entire book of Revelation. And so we see that in 7 through 16, these three cycles of judgment, but now they've ended. And as I've explained before, these are cycles of judgment that ultimately, generally mean the enemies of God's people are going to be judged. But as we saw in several places, their reaction, their response is not one that you would have expected from this kind of judgment. They remain unrepentant. So many times, like we talked about on Sunday, does the text say that they were unrepentant. All right, so in chapter 17 then, what we have here is something a little bit different. We have a picture, and it's a static image. In other words, nothing really happens per se. It's just an image, and it's this image of this harlot sitting upon a beast. And then we have an interpretation of this symbol. This is referred to using an ancient Greek term, but also it's used to talk about other things, in particular Greek and Roman culture, really a literary motif called ekphrasis, and this means like a description. So a classic example of this you find in Homer, where or Virgil's Aeneid rather, where you have a shield, and it describes the scenes on the shield or something like that, right? So that's what we have really in Revelation 17. It's unique. More important than that, maybe, is it's unique and it tells us what the symbols mean. And so I think what we have here, because we have a description, and we don't always have a description, we could make some conclusions about that, mainly, otherwise this would be really difficult. Or, on the other hand, and maybe it's both, it's not necessarily mutually exclusive, it could also mean that this is really important. It's not to say it's like more important than something else, but maybe important in terms of the general theme of the entire book. All right. So in 17, we have these figures, and as I said, we have the interpretation of the figure. The great whore, or as some of the older translations say, harlot. It refers to the great city that rules over the kings of the earth. Now let me just say here, I haven't talked much about this throughout, other than the introduction, but I think Revelation 17 really presents a major problem for people who want to date the book to an earlier time than the late first century. And that's because it's really hard to make these images that are clearly referring to Rome refer to Jerusalem, which is what many people have to do if they want to accept the date of the book being 70. So again, I'm not going to keep going about that. We've already talked about that, but I do want to say that I think 17 is pretty clear that this is Rome. Okay, all right, so we see the great whore is talked about as that great city, and then the beast upon which she sits with 7 heads refers to the 7 heads being 7 hills and kings who will make war with the Lamb. All right, so it's introduced in this way. Then one of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls came and said to me, "Come, I will show you the judgment of the great whore who is seated on many waters, with whom the kings of the earth have committed fornication, and with the wine of whose fornication the inhabitants of the earth have become drunk. Okay, so what does this image mean? It describes this whore, and she has committed fornication with the kings of the earth. Like, what does that mean? Obviously, not literal. So what does it mean metaphorically? Well, this idea is referred to several times in Revelation, so it's worth exploring. What does this mean? 17:2, like we just read, 18:3, and verse 9, and then Revelation 19:2. And so I think it's probably a reference to Rome's relations with other nations. It's almost, basically, they are only in this relationship for carnal gain, you might say. And I think maybe that's why the image is used. The image, of course, I say of course because Revelation is just filled with allusions to the Old Testament. But I think it's Isaiah 23, beginning in verse 15. At that time, Tyre will be forgotten for 70 years, the span of a king's life. But at the end of these 70 years, what will happen to Tyre, as in the song of the prostitute? Take up a harp, walk through the city, you forgotten prostitute, play the harp well, sing many a song so that you will be remembered. At the end of 70 years, Yahweh will deal with Tyre. She will return to her lucrative prostitution and will ply her trade with all the kingdoms of the face of the earth, right? And so again, I think the point of the image is, when you think about prostitution, it's about money, right? For the prostitute. For the person who is having relations with the prostitute, it's about carnality, right? But in either case, it's about selfish pleasure and gain. And that's the point of the comparison, I think. So that's why it's described as fornicating with kings of the earth, right? And I mean, you think about Rome's foreign policy. Are they really interested in protecting those other nations over whom they rule? I mean, the idea in the Roman Empire was, you pay us tribute, we'll protect you. We'll help you stay free. But what if a nation said, nah, we're not going to do that. We're not going to pay you tribute. Well, they probably wiped off the face of the earth, right? So why did Rome want to protect these nations? Just to keep the relationship only in it for their gain. So I think that's why it's referred to in that manner. All right? So now let's look at this description of the great whore. And then I think one of the things that makes Revelation so difficult is because the knowledge of Roman culture is difficult. A lot of us don't have access. We don't have time. And maybe we don't have the inclination necessarily. But this is one of the passages where I think it's clear that John is tapping in to a cultural awareness. And the symbol makes complete sense. If we didn't have a piece of evidence, this would be really difficult. And I think where we have good evidence here and we can figure out what's going on, we don't have it in other places. All right? What am I talking about? Well, hopefully that'll be clear in just a minute. All right, so here's the description. We'll read the entire description and then I'll tell you what I'm talking about specifically. So he carried me away in the spirit into a wilderness. And I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast that was full of blasphemous names. It had 7 heads and 10 horns. The woman was clothed in purple and scarlet and adorned with gold and jewels and pearls, holding in her hand a golden cup full of abominations and impurities of her fornication. And on her forehead was written a name, a mystery, Babylon the Great, mother of whores and of earth's abominations. And I saw that the woman was drunk with the blood of the saints and the blood of the witnesses to Jesus. All right, so what we find then is this woman seated on a beast. The beast has 7 heads. Later on, we have the interpretation of the 7 heads. There's 7 kings, but there are also 7 hills. All right, so this description really fits this coin that was minted at the time of Vespasian. This is This coin has a lot of very stereotypical features. So here you've got Kaiser Vespasianus. You have Augustus here for short. You have the Pontifex Maximus here, which means the high priest. Then you have the tribunal power, Pater Patriae, father of the fatherland. And then it says that he was consul 3 times, all right? We're not so interested in that, though. We're interested in what's on the other side. Here's a woman. Some people think this is clearly the goddess Roma, right? And she's seated on, it's hard to see. These are 7 hills, though. All right, so you've got the goddess Roma seated on 7 hills. This is a sword right here. This is the god river of the river Tiber. And here, I know you can't make this out, but this is the traditional motif of Romulus and Remus. Who were they? Anybody know who they were? What? Yep. Why are they important? Yeah, exactly. They're the founders of Rome. And they're being raised by a she-wolf, and this has them suckling that she-wolf. All right? All this is very close to what we have in Revelation 17. But somebody might say, well, wait a minute. This is the goddess Roma. This isn't a prostitute. Well, as I said, in the left-hand part of that coin, you have something like this, right? This is a very common motif for Romulus and Remus being raised by these she-wolves. Now, in Latin, the word for she-wolf is lupa. If you look this up in any good Latin lexicon, right now, if you were studying Latin, the Latin lexicon you want to use for classical Latin is the Oxford Latin Dictionary. You look this word up in the Oxford Latin Dictionary, it has 2 entries, a she-wolf and a prostitute. Okay? But just so you realize I'm not just making this up, right? Because I can make this up. I'm sorry if this insults anybody, but I really don't think anybody's going to be like, you know what, I'm going to check that out in the Oxford Latin Dictionary. When I get home, I don't think anybody's going to do that, okay? But just to show you, I'm not making this up. This is a passage from Cicero. It's a speech for his friend Milo, who was accused of killing somebody, so he's defending him. Cicero, among many things, he was a rhetorician. He was like a lawyer. So if you look here, there's our word. Well, what does it say? Well, the translation's here. I don't know how well you can see that, but it's like this other guy who is always leading, this word means prostitutes as well, always exhausted, talking about these prostitutes, always lupos, always prostitutes. Here it is, right here. And one of the most well-known Latin authors, he uses this same word to talk about prostitutes. So, if we go back to the image then, let's say John is familiar with this coin. But actually, a lot of scholars, these are classical scholars, they think that this coin is representative of an art, a work of art that many people would have been familiar with. So I think this is something that was in the cultural consciousness. John would have known about this. His audience would have known about this. So when he depicts this harlot sitting on this beast on 7 hills, this is too close of a coincidence to me. This is it. This is what he's talking about. I mean, I'm convinced that it is. And in that case, do you think it's a coincidence that he has this wolf here and he describes this female as a prostitute when the word can also mean prostitute? Again, I just think the coincidence is too great. Does this make sense, by the way? Okay, good. Something else here, though, that he mentions that I'll talk about now, or just a second. There are a couple of things I want to mention, but it's this mystery name of Babylon. But first of all, let's go back. She's sitting on a scarlet beast. We've seen that. The 7 heads and 10 horns. We've seen this full of blasphemous names. remember what I said, that the blasphemous names are probably those titles that were used to talk about these Roman emperors when in actual fact they ought to be talking about Jesus. Okay, so that's probably what that means. And then it says the woman was clothed in purple and scarlet. These are colors. Purple is associated with royalty, but also scarlet could be associated with prostitution. All right, it says she's adorned with gold and jewels and pearls. Why do you think she's adorned with gold, jewels, and pearls? Why is that detail here? Because you can't make that out on the coin, right? Why would she be dressed? You say she's dressed up, right? Why? Anybody have an idea? What? It could be wealth, all right? Could be to attract others, right? To increase, you might say, increase her prostitution. Could be that, okay? That's possible. All right, so she's holding in her hand a golden cup full of abominations, impurities of her fornication. And then we have this sort of strange statement. On her forehead was written the name, a mystery, Babylon the Great, mother of whores. Remember we talked about Babylon means Rome. If it didn't, this is the only place in Jewish literature where it meant something else. It means Rome, right? I mean, the plausibility of it meaning Rome, I think is very high, okay? But what does this mean, this mystery? Well, there's this idea that you find in several places that's mentioned here on the right, and that is that Rome has this secret name. So Servius, who wrote a commentary on Virgil, this is several centuries later, but Servius preserves a lot of Roman cultural information. And he says the Romans wanted to keep secret the identity of the God who cared for Rome, and therefore their priestly regulations decreed that the gods of Rome should not be invoked by their proper names, that they might not be enticed away. All right, so he mentions that they had this name that only the priests knew. Nobody else knew that. But look on the left, okay? So this was found in a wall graffito from Pompeii. Remember, we watched the video a while back about Pompeii. Now, that's a horrible tragedy, but on the other hand, it's pretty good for understanding everyday life in Rome, if Pompeii is anything like other cities, and people assume it is. Now, I would not recommend Googling graffiti in Pompeii. Just put it that way. Now, me saying that probably makes you think, hey, maybe I ought to do that. I don't recommend it, okay? It's not for young audiences, okay? So, don't recommend it. Anyway, in other words, don't try to find this. I would recommend. But there is a graffito where you have this. You have this, like, box, okay? So there's Roma. There's Roma. What's amor? Anybody know what that means? Yeah, exactly. Right. It's Rome or Roma backward. So some people think that's the secret name. Not just because of this, because in other texts it's explicitly mentioned that that is her name. All right? So if that's the case, when he says her name's a mystery, the mystery is Babylon, mother of whores. It could be that John is using that cultural idea and basically dragging it through the mud. Her name isn't love. It's harlotry. It's prostitution, right? So that is, I think that's less clear than the symbolism that matches the coin, which I think is very strong. I would consider this to be a good possibility. But maybe not necessarily. That's definitely it. I wouldn't say that. I wouldn't be that strong about that. Okay, so anything else about this? Okay, well again, notice verse 6. It mentions that the woman was drunk with the blood of the saints and the blood of the witnesses to Jesus. Again, this is this motif that we've seen. That again, I haven't brought this up in a while, but it doesn't mean that there's empire-wide persecution, but it does mean Christians are being persecuted. And we talked about this before, why that would be the case. I mean, you live among people who are very much willing to participate in the emperor cult, and you say, I'm not going to do that. Well, you're going to stand out. And people are going to think you might be an enemy to the state if you don't participate in something like that. All right? So that would lead to persecution for sure, even though it may not necessarily be on an empire-wide level. All right, so here is the explanation of the beast. When I saw her, I was greatly amazed. And here we have a motif that's very common in apocalyptic literature, although in Revelation, admittedly, we haven't encountered this very much at all, but that is in interpreting angels. This angel says, "Why are you so amazed? I will tell you the mystery of the woman and of the beast with 7 heads and 10 horns that carries her. The beast that you saw was and is not and is about to ascend from the bottomless pit and go to destruction. And the inhabitants of the earth, whose name have not been written in the book of life from the foundation of the world, will be amazed when they see the beast, because it was and is not and is to come." So this is a little difficult when it says it was, it is not, it is to come. That could again be yet another reference to this notion of Nero redivivus. Remember, Nero returning from the dead, just tapping into that idea. That could very well be it. Yeah.
Going back to verse 2, it might be a stretch or whatever, but is there a reference to the apostate church in there at all?
Verse 2.
Well, when it says whom the kings of the earth committed fornication, I didn't know if there was a meddling between the state and the church.
Maybe I'm misunderstanding.
With those in the church that meddling with the harlot being a description of many times with the church, and I don't know. Obviously, it's a stretch on there, but I just thought maybe there was a reference in 17 to the church having the church involved in this too, with those that were unfaithful.
Yeah, I mean, I don't really see that. I think it really is talking about Rome's political allies overtly. If it does have that component, it doesn't seem very clear to me. That's the way I'll put it. All right. Any other questions about anything so far? Okay. As I said, this last part may be another reference to that notion about Nero returning. And basically the general idea, and this is important for what we're about to talk about, is not that there's a specific individual in mind necessarily. It's this idea. The stuff that Nero did is going to happen again. What sort of stuff did Nero do? He persecuted Christians. So I think that's why this motif of Nero returning is so powerful and stated so many times in the book of Revelation, because the point is it's going to happen again, right? Christians are going to be persecuted again like they were in the time of Nero. All right, so now we get to, I don't know how else to put this. This is one of the most difficult passages in the entire book, okay? So I'll just do my best. So it says, "This calls for a mind that has wisdom." Now already there's a bit of a problem here. Remember the ancient manuscripts, the ancient copies that we have, there's no punctuation. So we don't have commas, we don't have periods. Here we don't have this colon. So we could, this notion, "this calls for a mind that has wisdom," could go back to what he said earlier. It doesn't necessarily go with this. This translation puts it with verse 9, but it actually could be talking about verse 8. Probably it does. Okay, that's not terribly important. What's more important is what is now going to be said. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman is seated. We know what that means. We saw the coin. That's not difficult. But the 7 kings part is, there are 7 kings, of whom 5 have fallen, 1 is living, the other has not yet come. When he comes, he must remain for only a little while. As for the beast that was and is not, it is 8th, but it belongs to the 7th. It goes to destruction. Verse 11 is difficult too. But really, verse 10 is the problem. reading it superficially, sounds like 5 kings have died, right? There's one currently alive, and there's one that will come and he will only reign for a little bit, right? That seems like that's exactly what it's talking about. Well, the problem is, how do you count the Roman emperors? And the problem is at the very beginning. Is Julius Caesar the first Roman emperor? Okay, so let's imagine that he is. Let's imagine that John considers him the first Roman emperor. All right, so 5 have fallen. So that's Julius Caesar, Octavian, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius. That's 5. Nero is still living, and there's one yet to come. Well, who is that? Well, that could be any of the next 3, right? But what if Julius Caesar isn't the first emperor? What if John considered Octavian Augustus to be the first one? Okay, well then we have Octavian, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, Nero, and while he's writing, it's one of the 3 that only reigned during part of AD 69, and then Vespasian is the one to come, okay? But some scholars argue that actually, some scholars of Revelation argue that you shouldn't count Galba, Otho, Vitellius. They weren't real emperors. I mean, they only reigned for a few months. How real can they be? So just take them out. Okay, well, do you see, it still matters who you choose first, right? Now, some people actually say, well, Caligula's first. Why would Caligula be first? Well, because he's the first emperor to reign after the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. His reign begins after that. So he's the first. Well, you see how the counting's can be completely different if that's the case. Some people would say Nero's first. Why? Because he features so predominantly in Revelation. You can imagine that as a real possibility. But what if it's emperors deified by the Senate? And then Domitian would be, in this case, the emperor that still reigns. Is everybody confused? Good. It's that confusing. There are so many possibilities. Another possibility, emperors who died violently. There are a bunch of them. Maybe he's only counting those. The short of it is, when you see so many possibilities, I didn't count them all, but it's a bunch, okay? A bunch of possibilities as to count this up. I don't have the foggiest notion how to do it. And I don't think anybody else does either. And I'm not trying to be flippant about it. It's just when it's this problematic, either we just simply can't get at who he's talking about, or we can understand it symbolically. Okay, so I know I'm not going to ask, does this make sense? Because it probably doesn't. Does my explanation of the difficulties make sense? Okay, that's all I'm worried about, because this is complicated. It really is. So again, where do you start? Where do you end? I don't know. So I think it's better to see that this is to be understood symbolically. I mean, after all, how many kings are there? He mentions 7. Does Revelation like the number 7? Yes. 53 times in the book the number 7 is used. So how literally should we take that number in the book of Revelation? Also, something that may or may not be a feature of this, but traditionally, Rome was governed by 7 kings. All right, so in Italy, the early history of Italy, the Romans aren't ruling over everybody. It's a bunch of tribes. The Etruscans actually were ruling for a while. If you want to study an interesting ancient culture, the Etruscans were very interesting. But anyway, Rome took over after they did. But one major part of Roman history that they never really forgot was a kingdom. It's not the same thing as an empire, but a kingdom. 753, which is the traditional date for the founding of Rome, 753 to 509 BC, they had 7 kings. So again, the author could be appealing to that notion of 7 kings. All right, so let me summarize. Maybe this isn't what he means. Maybe he actually does mean that specific reference to these kings. 5 have fallen, one is yet to come, but will only reign a little while. Maybe he does mean somebody specifically. I just don't know who it is, and I don't think anybody else does either. So it could be that, or it could be he does mean this symbolically. And I think this idea of it happening to be the number 7 makes this I think an even stronger argument. All right, any questions about this? Yeah. Okay, good. Yeah. See anybody else? No, go ahead. Sorry.
Could that be another reference to Nero Julius?
Yeah, it could. But I guess, yes, it could. But does that change how we count it, maybe? And I would say it depends on how he conceptualizes Nero Redivivus. Does he mean it only with reference to Domitian? Because then if he does, we could count back that way. And that's what some people have done. You're right. That's a good possibility. But does he mean it in a more general way? And I think he does both with it. I think sometimes he refers to Domitian when he refers to this motif, and other times I think he's more general. So, yeah, that is a good possibility. But do I think we can count back from that? No, I still am not so confident in that. So, any other questions? Yeah.
I think that the number 7 could be used as completeness in this passage.
Well, that's a good question because that is what it means sometimes, right? But in this case, in what sense do you mean completeness?
As in, like, the Rome is complete and now there's more yet to come or something like that, you know?
Yeah, but I mean, that would almost sound like complimentary, right? And I don't think he's going to be complimentary toward Rome in this context, unless you mean complete in the sense that there is a specific number and whatever that is, we'll just call it 7, which I know is a little bit abstract. Maybe we don't like that level of abstraction. Anything else? Okay, well, don't feel great about that. I wish I could say something better, but I'm not going to pretend like I know something when I don't, because I don't know about this. All right, so now we get something we can say more about. And that is this description in verse 14. But first, verse 12. The 10 horns that you saw are 10 kings that have not yet received the kingdom, but they are to receive authority as kings for 1 hour together with the beast. Again, this 1 hour, I mean, does he mean literally 60 minutes? Of course he doesn't mean that. He just means for a short time. It's very much an apocalyptic way to say that. John has made such statements before as well. I think these might be referring to client kings, these kings that Rome used at various times to sort of enforce their will. But anyway, they are united in yielding their power and authority to the beast. They will make war on the Lamb, and the Lamb will conquer them, for he is Lord of lords and King of kings, and those with him are called and chosen and faithful. So I said this before, particularly, I mean, it's way back now in 4 and 5 when we talk about the Lamb. Here, it says the Lamb will conquer them, for he's Lord of lords and King of kings. When you think of Lord of lords and King of kings, I don't really think about a lamb, right? If it said lion, you think, okay, that makes sense. But a lamb is Lord of lords and King of kings? Now, this title you find in quite a few places, typically, as you would imagine, talking about Yahweh, but not always. So in Daniel 4:37, this is in the Septuagint. Daniel 4 is different, quite different here in the Septuagint. That's a different story. But anyway, to the Most High I extol and praise, to the one who created the heavens, the earth, the seas, the rivers, and all that are in them. I extol and praise because he is God of gods, Lord of lords, and King of kings. We got 1 Enoch here. It's a very important text. I've mentioned this before, but it's in the pseudepigrapha. It's very early, at least part of it is, 3rd century BC. These are the angels saying, bring our cause before the Most High. And they said to the Lord of the ages, Lord of lords, God of gods, King of kings, and God of the ages, the throne of your glory remains, etc. All right? But there are other references that aren't to Yahweh. And so this is typical of ancient Near Eastern kings to use this title of King of Kings. For thus says the Lord God, Ezekiel 26:7, I will bring against Tyre from the north King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, King of kings, together with horses, chariots, cavalry, and a great and powerful army. And then Ezra 2:11, this is a copy of the letter that King Artaxerxes gave to the priest Ezra, the scribe, the scholar of the text of the commandments of Yahweh and his statutes for Israel. Artaxerxes, king of kings, to the priest Ezra, the scribe, the law of the God of heaven, peace. And so this is something that is very much indicative of these ancient Near Eastern kings, but this also carries forward into Greek and Roman culture, although not as much as it is here. Again, though, maybe I'm making too much of this, but this is just, could you imagine, I've used this analogy before, but could you imagine you being a Christian here, and let's say you're hearing Revelation read the first time, and you hear this part read, and you're walking home, and somebody sees you that's not a Christian, they're like, hey, what are you doing in there? In this building? You know, somebody's home probably. What are you doing in there? They'd be like, well, we were reading this text, this new text that we just got. Oh, really? What's it about? I'd be like, well, it's about the fall of Rome. And we talked about how ridiculous that would have sounded. But then maybe, this is totally made up, of course, but what if they said, yeah, but specifically, like, what do you guys say? Like, what was said today? He said, well, it's about this Lamb who's the Lord of Lords and King of Kings. Can you imagine how ridiculous that would have sounded to somebody? A Lamb that is Lord of Lords and King of Kings. Not just Lord, I mean, that's significant enough, but Lord of Lords and King of Kings. I mean, it's not enough to be king. He's King of Kings. And then somebody says, well, okay, or this neighbor says, yeah, well, all right, who is this guy? Well, Jesus of Nazareth. They'd be like, well, where is he? Well, he died. Okay, how did he die? Well, he was crucified. What? And then you say, yeah, he was crucified, but he didn't stay dead. He rose from the grave. Be like, what are you talking about? Like, that would not have resonated very much. But here it is. And so here, it's a paradox to call this Lamb the Lord of Lords and King of Kings. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, isn't also going back to Revelation 5, the throne room scene where he is praised and honored as the Lamb.
Yeah, exactly, right. And there, it's juxtaposed with this image of him being a lion from the tribe of Judah, which makes a lot more sense. But in Revelation, very typically, much more often, he's referred to as the Lamb. So yeah, exactly. That's right. Yeah.
You really get a feel for the idea of a stumbling block and foolishness.
Yes. Good. Exactly. That's right. It would have been foolishness to Gentiles. We know it was. There are later writers who are making fun of this idea. But yet, here it is, and it's in so many other places too. Yeah.
Wouldn't Paul face the same ridicule on Mars Hill when he talked about the resurrection?
Yeah, exactly.
And there was reactions, some were positive, some
Yeah.
silly.
Right. That speech in Mars Hill, there's so much there. But what's interesting is Paul quotes from Stoic sources. We have the sources that he quotes from. A lot of what he's saying, those philosophers would have been like, yeah, I can go along with that. But when he mentions the resurrection, forget it. That's when, okay, they're lost then. He loses them. Because when you die, generally in Roman culture, you don't come back. And you certainly don't come back in a body. That's just nonsense. And that's where he loses them. So right, exactly. That shows a particular disjunction, you might say, between what they would have assumed to be possible and what Christianity just proclaims as the truth, right? Well, again, we have that here as well. All right? What time is class over? I know that, Tommy. We've gone through this. Okay, let me be more specific. What time does the second bell ring, Tommy?
I don't know.
I'm pretty forgetful, but I think we had this conversation before. First bell's already rang. Yep. Okay. What? 20 till. Okay. Thank you. Somebody that has the information. Okay, I'm not going to say that. All right. So anything else before we conclude? Guess not. All right. See you guys Sunday.